Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Roanoke, Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1898, a time when Roanoke had established itself as the Star City of the South, a bustling railroad hub nestled between the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountains. The Norfolk and Western Railway had transformed what was once the small settlement of Big Lick into a thriving industrial center. Streets that had been quiet country roads just 20 years earlier now echoed with the sounds of commerce and industry. Elegant Victorian homes lined the avenues near downtown, while working-class neighborhoods sprawled outward, housing the thousands of men who labored in the railway yards. But beneath the veneer of progress and Victorian propriety lay darker currents, secrets that would eventually surface in ways that would haunt the collective memory of this southwestern Virginia town for generations. It began with reports of a strange man seen wandering the outskirts of town, his face concealed beneath heavy bandages. Some said he was a victim of a terrible accident at the railroad yard, where such injuries were tragically common. Others whispered that he was a war veteran, his face mangled beyond recognition in some distant conflict. Few could have imagined the truth, that beneath those bandages lay the self-inflicted wounds of a man desperate to escape his past, a man who had once stood before congregations and spoken the word of God with such conviction that people traveled for miles just to hear him preach. This is the disturbing account of Reverend Elias Blackwood and the trail of deception that led to what locals would come to call the Roanoke case. The Callahan farm sat on the eastern edge of Roanoke County, a modest property with a small white farmhouse overlooking fields that stretched toward the distant mountains. The farm had been in Thomas Callahan's family for 3 generations, surviving the economic devastation of the Civil War and the uncertain years that followed. Thomas and his wife, Margaret, had worked tirelessly to maintain the property, but age was beginning to take its toll. Thomas had just turned 52, and years of physical labor had left him with a persistent ache in his back and shoulders. Margaret, 7 years his junior, managed the household with quiet efficiency, but the couple had no children to help with the increasingly demanding work. It was here, in February of 1898, that Margaret Callahan first encountered the stranger who would change her life forever. She had been hanging laundry on the line when she spotted him at the edge of the property, a tall figure in a dark coat, his face obscured by what appeared to be surgical bandages. The day was cold, with a biting wind that made her fingers numb as she pinned the sheets to the line, but the stranger seemed oblivious to the temperature, standing motionless at the boundary where the cultivated fields met the wild tangle of undergrowth. I remember how still he stood, Margaret would later tell investigators. It wasn't natural the way he watched, not moving at all, just standing there at the edge of our property. When I called out to ask if he needed help, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the tree line. I thought perhaps he was lost, or maybe one of those unfortunate souls displaced by the economic troubles in town. The encounter left Margaret unsettled, though she couldn't have explained why. There was something in the stranger's posture, a kind of coiled intensity, that had made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. When Thomas returned from town that evening, she mentioned the incident. But he dismissed her concerns. Drifters were common in the area, he reminded her, especially in the winter months when work was scarce and men traveled in search of employment. 3 days later, the stranger appeared again, this time approaching the house directly. Margaret was alone, as Thomas had gone into Roanoke to purchase supplies. She watched through the kitchen window as the man made his way up the long dirt drive that led to the farmhouse. His gait was deliberate, each step measured, as if he were counting the distance. As he drew nearer, she could see that his entire head was wrapped in bandages, with only narrow slits for his eyes and mouth. He wore a heavy black coat that reached almost to his ankles, and his hands were covered by thick gloves despite the relative mildness of the day. For a moment, Margaret considered barring the door, but curiosity overcame her apprehension. The stranger knocked 3 times, the sound unexpectedly delicate, almost tentative. When she opened the door, he stood with his head slightly bowed, as if in deference or perhaps embarrassment. The stranger introduced himself as Joseph Morris, explaining that he had suffered terrible burns in a house fire that had claimed his family in West Virginia. He spoke in a hoarse whisper, explaining that his vocal cords had been damaged in the fire. The bandages, he said, concealed wounds too horrific to be seen in polite company. He had been traveling east, looking for work and a place to begin again, away from the memories that haunted him in his home state. He spoke with such sadness, Margaret recalled, such conviction in his voice despite the hoarseness. He asked for work, said he could help with the farm in exchange for a place to stay. Thomas had been complaining about needing help with the spring planting, and there was something in Mr. Morris's manner, a kind of quiet dignity, that made me trust him. Margaret offered the stranger a cup of coffee, which he accepted, though she noticed that he turned away slightly to drink, as if reluctant to reveal even the lower portion of his face. His gloved hands handled the cup awkwardly, and she wondered how extensive his burns might be. They sat at the kitchen table, the ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the silence between Morris's brief responses to her polite questions. He volunteered little about himself beyond what he had already shared. He had been a laborer, he said, working various jobs throughout West Virginia. The fire had occurred 6 months earlier, destroying not only his home and family, but also any documentation of his identity. He had been traveling since then, taking odd jobs when he could find them, sleeping in barns or, when the weather permitted, outdoors. "I don't need much," he told Margaret, his voice barely audible. "Just honest work and a quiet place to rest. I know my appearance is disturbing. I can keep to myself, stay out of sight when you have visitors." When Thomas returned that evening, he was initially suspicious of the bandaged stranger, but eventually agreed to let him stay in the small cabin that stood behind the main house, a structure that had once housed farmhands, but had been empty for years. The cabin was simple, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table, and a chair. The roof leaked in places, and the windows were covered with oilcloth rather than glass, but it offered shelter from the elements and, importantly, privacy. Morris proved to be a diligent worker, rising before dawn and working tirelessly until sunset. He performed whatever tasks Thomas assigned without complaint, from repairing fences to clearing new ground for planting. His strength seemed at odds with his apparent injuries. He could lift heavy loads and work for hours without rest, showing no signs of the physical limitations one might expect from someone who had survived severe burns. He kept to himself, taking his meals alone in the cabin and rarely engaging in conversation beyond what was necessary to discuss the farm work. When Thomas or Margaret spoke to him, he listened attentively but responded sparingly, his hoarse whisper requiring them to lean in to hear his words. The bandages remained in place at all times, though they appeared to be changed regularly, always clean despite the dirty nature of farm labor. There was something familiar about his mannerisms, Thomas would later report. The way he held himself, the careful precision of his movements. It was as if he was always aware of being watched, even when he was alone. And his eyes, you couldn't see much through those slits in the bandages, but when you did catch a glimpse, there was an intensity there that was unsettling. As winter gave way to spring, Joseph Morris became a fixture at the Callahan farm. Though he remained aloof, the family grew accustomed to his presence. Margaret would leave food on the porch of the cabin, and each morning she would find the empty plate waiting for her. Sometimes she would hear him moving about at night, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, as he paced the small confines of the cabin. Once she thought she heard him speaking, his voice no longer a whisper but resonant and clear, as if he were addressing an unseen audience. "I didn't think much of it at first," she later explained. "Many people talk to themselves when alone, especially those who have experienced tragedy. I assumed he might be praying or perhaps speaking to the memory of his lost family." It wasn't until later that I began to wonder if there might be another explanation. What the Callahans didn't know, couldn't have known, was that their mysterious tenant was living a double life. When darkness fell, Joseph Morris would carefully remove his bandages and transform himself into another person entirely. Using a small mirror he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he would apply ointments to the self-inflicted wounds on his face. Deep, deliberate scars that formed a grotesque mask, designed to render him unrecognizable to those who had known him in his previous life. In the flickering light of a single candle, he would practice different expressions, watching how the scars distorted his features, learning to use this new face as an instrument of expression. And he would speak, not in the hoarse whisper he used with the Callahans, but in a rich, melodious baritone that had once held congregations spellbound. He would recite passages from Scripture, his voice rising and falling in practiced cadences, filling the small cabin with the powerful rhetoric that had been his signature as Reverend Elias Blackwood. Then, certain nights, when the moon provided enough light to travel by, Morris would leave the cabin through a window rather than the door, careful to avoid the squeaking hinge that might alert the Callahans to his movements. He would make his way through the woods that bordered the farm, following a path he had gradually cleared over weeks of nocturnal journeys. In a hollow tree about a mile from the cabin, he kept a change of clothes, not the rough workman's garments he wore as Morris, but a well-tailored black suit befitting a man of the cloth. In the nearby town of Salem, just west of Roanoke, a different man had begun to make an impression. Calling himself Brother Thomas Ward, he appeared occasionally at various churches, offering to preach when regular ministers were ill or away. His face, though marked with what he described as birthmarks, was not so disfigured as to repulse. His speaking voice, however, was extraordinary, a powerful instrument that could shift from gentle murmurs to thunderous proclamations with ease. His sermons were unlike anything I had heard before, recalled Jonathan Mercer, a deacon at First Baptist Church in Salem. He spoke of sin and redemption in a way that seemed drawn from personal experience, as if he had walked through the darkest valleys and emerged transformed. There was no artificial piety in his manner, none of the affected holiness you sometimes find in preachers. He spoke as one who had confronted true evil and understood its allure. Brother Ward never stayed in one place for long. He would appear at a church, deliver a few remarkable sermons that left the congregation buzzing with excitement, and then move on, explaining that he was called to carry the word to as many communities as possible. He declined offers of permanent positions, insisting that his ministry was itinerant by divine design. When pressed about his background, he would share only that he had studied at a seminary in Kentucky and had been traveling the region for several years. There was a sadness about him, said Sarah Jenkins, who heard Ward preach at a Methodist church in Salem. Not in his words, his sermons were full of hope and the promise of redemption, but in his eyes. When the Spirit wasn't moving through him, when he was just sitting quietly or listening to others speak, there was a profound melancholy in his expression, as if he carried some terrible burden. What no one realized was that Brother Ward was traveling east from the Callahan farm, carefully timing his appearances to ensure he could return before dawn. The man who worked silently with bandaged face by day was, by night, mesmerizing congregations with his oratory. The transformation required meticulous planning, a change of clothes hidden in the woods, the careful application of different bandages and coverings to alter the appearance of his facial scars, for Brother Ward claimed to have suffered injuries as well, though less severe than those of Joseph Morris. He spoke of a childhood accident, a fire that had left him with scars, but had also, he suggested, been the catalyst for his spiritual awakening. The marks on his face, visible but not grotesque, lent him an air of having been tested by suffering, of having endured and transcended physical pain, a powerful narrative for a spiritual leader. This dual existence might have continued indefinitely had Margaret Callahan not experienced a moment of recognition. One Sunday in April, she attended a service in Salem where Brother Ward was preaching. There was something in his cadence, in the particular way he emphasized certain words, that struck her as familiar. Though she couldn't place the connection immediately, the seed of suspicion had been planted. The way he held the Bible, his left hand supporting the spine, while his right turned the pages, it was precisely how Mr. Morris held his dinner plate on the rare occasions when he ate with us, Margaret later explained. Such a small thing, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee the similarities. Margaret said nothing to Thomas about her suspicions, but she began to pay closer attention to their tenant. She noticed how his absences seemed to coincide with reports of Brother Ward's appearances in neighboring communities. She observed the way he avoided direct sunlight, preferring to work in the shadows of trees or buildings. And she began to wonder about the true nature of the injuries hidden beneath his bandages. One day, I intentionally approached the cabin without calling out first, as had become our custom, out of respect for his privacy, Margaret recalled. I heard him speaking inside, not the whisper we were accustomed to, but a full, rich voice reciting what sounded like a sermon. When I knocked, there was a sudden silence, followed by the sound of movement. When he finally opened the door, his voice had returned to the familiar hoarse whisper. Meanwhile, in the wider region, whispers had begun to circulate about a different matter entirely. Several churches across Virginia and West Virginia had reported missing funds following visits from traveling preachers. The amounts were never large enough to draw immediate attention. A collection plate that seemed lighter than usual, a building fund that showed unexplained discrepancies. But when authorities began to compile reports, a pattern emerged. In each case, a charismatic preacher had appeared, stayed for a short time, gained the trust of the congregation, and then moved on. The descriptions varied. Some remembered a tall man with a scar along his jaw. Others recalled a slight figure with a burn on his left cheek. The common thread was an exceptional speaking voice and a profound knowledge of Scripture. It was as if he knew exactly what each community needed to hear, said Sheriff William Polson of Montgomery County. He would tailor his sermons to address local concerns, making references to events or situations that resonated with the congregation. By the time anyone realized something was amiss, he had already moved on. The investigation might never have connected these incidents to the man at the Callahan farm had Thomas not decided to make improvements to the cabin where Morris resided. One afternoon in early May, while Morris was working in a distant field, Thomas entered the cabin to measure for a new window. What he found beneath the loose floorboard changed everything. Inside a small wooden box were stacks of cash, more money than a farmhand could have legitimately earned, along with various items of clerical attire, several different sets of bandages, and a journal. The journal contained detailed notes about churches throughout the region, including collection schedules, security arrangements, and the names of key personnel. The handwriting was meticulous, Thomas later testified. Each entry included the date of the visit, the amount taken, and observations about how to improve the technique. It was the work of a calculating mind, someone who saw these thefts as a kind of scientific experiment. Most disturbing of all was a small leather case containing surgical instruments and a bottle of acid. Thomas realized with horror that the scars on Morris's face might not be the result of an accident, but deliberate disfigurement, a mask designed to hide his true identity. Thomas also discovered a collection of newspaper clippings from various parts of Kentucky and West Virginia, dating back several years. Many concerned a minister named Elias Blackwood, who had disappeared from his church in Louisville after allegations of financial misconduct. The articles described Blackwood as a charismatic speaker whose sermons had drawn large crowds. Accompanying the clippings was a faded photograph of Blackwood standing in front of his church, a tall, distinguished man with sharp features and penetrating eyes. The resemblance to the glimpses Thomas had caught of Morris's eyes through the bandages was unmistakable. Rather than confronting Morris directly, Thomas rode into Roanoke to alert the authorities. Sheriff James Richardson assembled a small group of deputies and returned with Thomas to the farm, planning to apprehend Morris when he returned from the fields. But when they arrived, Margaret was in a state of agitation. Morris had returned early, she explained, and had seen Thomas riding toward town. Seemingly sensing that his deception had been discovered, he had gathered his few possessions and fled. He seemed to know exactly what had happened, Margaret told the sheriff. He didn't say a word, just looked at me with those eyes through the slits in his bandages. Then he went into the cabin, emerged a few minutes later with a small bag, and walked away toward the woods. He moved differently, not like the quiet farmhand we knew, but with purpose and authority. The subsequent manhunt revealed the extraordinary extent of Elias Blackwood's deception. His real identity was uncovered through a flyer circulated by authorities in Kentucky, where Blackwood had served as minister of a prosperous church in Louisville until 1896. He had disappeared after allegations of financial impropriety, taking with him a substantial amount of the church's money. The Reverend Blackwood was greatly respected in our community, wrote Deacon Samuel Foster in a statement to Virginia authorities. His sermons drew people from neighboring counties. No one questioned his absences, as he claimed to be visiting the sick or engaging in missionary work. It was only after he vanished that we began to examine the church accounts and discovered the extent of his theft. What made the case particularly disturbing was the evidence found in Blackwood's cabin suggesting that he had deliberately altered his appearance. Medical experts consulted by the sheriff concluded that the scars described by those who had seen Blackwood's uncovered face were consistent with self-inflicted chemical burns, likely created using the acid found in his possession. He didn't merely disguise himself temporarily, as a common criminal might, wrote Dr. Edward Holcomb in his assessment. He permanently altered his features, enduring what must have been excruciating pain to create a new identity. This speaks to a level of commitment to deception that is, in my experience, unprecedented. Among the papers discovered in the cabin was a detailed account of the transformation process. Blackwood had apparently studied medical texts to understand how to inflict wounds that would create the desired effect without causing life-threatening damage. He had experimented with different chemicals and techniques, documenting the results with clinical detachment. The entries described not just the physical process, but also the psychological experience of watching his former face disappear, replaced by something unrecognizable. "The pain is transcendent," one entry read. "It strips away all pretense, all social masks. In those moments of agony, I am reduced to my essential self, neither Reverend Blackwood, nor Joseph Morris, nor Brother Ward, but something more fundamental. Perhaps this is what the mystics seek through their devotions, this raw experience of existence beyond identity." As authorities pieced together Blackwood's movements over the previous 2 years, a pattern of escalating deception emerged. Beginning with simple disguises and short-term impostures, he had gradually developed more elaborate personas, sometimes maintaining multiple identities simultaneously in neighboring communities. The bandaged Joseph Morris and the charismatic Brother Ward represented the culmination of this evolution, 2 distinct characters alternating within the same geographic area, neither bearing any resemblance to the original Elias Blackwood. "It's as if he was conducting an experiment in identity," Sheriff Richardson observed. Each new persona was more fully realized than the last, with more detailed backstories and more convincing mannerisms. The level of planning involved is staggering. He must have spent months preparing each new character before ever appearing in public. The investigation revealed another disturbing aspect of the case. Among Blackwood's possessions was a collection of newspaper clippings reporting on his various crimes and disappearances. He appeared to take pride in his ability to evade capture, annotating the articles with corrections and commentary. "They have no understanding of transformation," he wrote beside one account. "They search for a man who no longer exists." Most unsettling was a letter, apparently intended for publication after his death, in which Blackwood explained his philosophy. "The face we present to the world is nothing but a mask," he wrote. I have merely made literal what others do figuratively. We are all impostors, playing roles dictated by society. I have simply chosen to play many roles rather than accepting the limitation of a single identity. The letter continued, delving into a disturbing theological justification for his actions. God created man in his own image, but what if that image is not fixed, but fluid? Perhaps the divine nature is not singular, but multiple, manifesting in countless forms. My transformations might be seen as a form of worship, an acknowledgement that identity is not the rigid construct we pretend it to be, but a fluid state that can be molded by will and circumstance. These writings suggested a mind that had moved beyond mere criminal calculation into a realm of philosophical justification that bordered on the delusional. Blackwood appeared to view his deceptions not as crimes, but as a form of art or even spiritual practice, a perspective that made him all the more dangerous. The manhunt for Elias Blackwood extended throughout the summer of 1898, with law enforcement agencies across Virginia and neighboring states alerted to watch for a man who might appear in any guise. The challenge, of course, was that traditional descriptions were useless. Blackwood could alter his appearance at will, changing not just superficial aspects like clothing and hair, but fundamental features through the application of his grotesque self-mutilation techniques. "We're not looking for a specific face or figure," Sheriff Richardson told reporters from the Roanoke Times. "We're searching for patterns of behavior, for the particular charisma that seems to be Blackwood's signature regardless of the identity he assumes. But I won't deny that this makes our task enormously difficult." Despite an extensive search, Elias Blackwood was never apprehended. Sightings were reported across Virginia and neighboring states in the months following his disappearance from the Callahan farm, but none could be confirmed. Some believed he had fled west, perhaps to California or the territories, where a man might more easily reinvent himself. Others suspected he might have left the country entirely, taking his considerable criminal proceeds to establish a new life abroad. The most persistent theory, however, held that Blackwood hadn't gone far at all. In the years following his disappearance, reports occasionally surfaced of traveling preachers or salesmen who displayed unusual charisma or persuasive abilities. Though their appearances varied widely, witnesses sometimes noted an odd quality to their faces, as if the features had been somehow rearranged. The genius of Blackwood's method was its adaptability, Sheriff Richardson would later write in his memoirs. By continually altering his appearance through both temporary disguises and permanent changes, he rendered traditional methods of identification useless. How do you search for a man who might look like anyone? The Callahan family never fully recovered from their brush with the man they had known as Joseph Morris. Thomas became suspicious of strangers, installing additional locks on the doors and refusing to hire outside help for the farm. Margaret, perhaps more deeply affected, developed an interest in physiognomy, the pseudoscientific study of facial features, becoming convinced that one could discern a person's true character if one looked closely enough. "There were signs we missed," she insisted to anyone who would listen, "something in the eyes that never changed, regardless of the bandages or scars. Had we known what to look for, we might have seen the deception from the beginning." The cabin where Morris Blackwood had lived stood empty for years afterward, the Callahans unable to bring themselves to rent it again. Local children began to tell stories about it, claiming that on certain nights a light could be seen moving inside, as if someone were pacing back and forth, practicing a sermon that would never be delivered. In the wider community, the case inspired a period of intense suspicion. Traveling preachers, once welcomed without question, found themselves subjected to careful scrutiny and sometimes outright rejection. Churches began to require letters of introduction and verification of credentials before allowing visitors to address their congregations. The open hospitality that had characterized rural Virginia communities gave way to a more cautious approach to strangers. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond those directly involved. The idea that someone could so thoroughly transform themselves, not just through temporary disguise, but through permanent self-mutilation, struck at the core of how people understood identity. If you couldn't trust the face you saw before you, what could you trust? Blackwood's crime was not just theft or fraud, wrote Professor James Harrington of Roanoke College in a 1905 analysis of the case. It was a fundamental assault on the social contract, which depends on the assumption that people are who they appear to be. By demonstrating how easily that assumption can be subverted, he undermined the basic trust that allows communities to function. The case might have faded from public memory entirely had it not been for a series of events beginning in 1901, 3 years after Blackwood's disappearance from the Callahan farm. In a small town in western North Carolina, a respected doctor named Samuel Graves was found dead in his office, an apparent suicide. Beside his body was a letter confessing to a series of frauds perpetrated across the Southeast, in which he had posed as various medical professionals, gaining access to hospitals and private homes where he stole drugs and valuables. The letter made reference to my previous transformations in Virginia and described techniques of facial modification that bore a striking resemblance to those documented in Blackwood's journals. Authorities initially dismissed the connection as coincidental, but further investigation revealed that Graves had appeared in the town just months after Blackwood's disappearance, and that despite his claimed medical credentials, no record could be found of his training or previous practice. The Graves case demonstrates how Blackwood continued to evolve his methods, wrote Sheriff Richardson in a supplementary report. He had moved from religious imposture to medical fraud, recognizing perhaps that doctors, like ministers, are granted an immediate trust and authority in most communities. The facial alterations had become more sophisticated, creating an appearance that aroused no suspicion at all rather than the more dramatic scarring of his earlier disguises. If Graves was indeed Blackwood, as many came to believe, then his apparent suicide represented yet another deception. The body found in the doctor's office had been badly damaged by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the face, making identification difficult, and several items mentioned in the office inventory, including a leather case of surgical instruments, were missing from the scene, suggesting that the suicide might have been staged. Over the next decade, similar cases emerged across the southern states. A teacher in Georgia, a lawyer in Alabama, a banker in Mississippi, each involving a charismatic figure who appeared suddenly in a community, established a position of trust, and then disappeared after committing some form of fraud. In several instances, these disappearances coincided with the discovery of bodies that were tentatively identified as the missing imposter, only for evidence to later suggest that the identification was mistaken. We may be dealing with a single individual who has elevated identity fraud to an art form, wrote federal investigator Robert Harper in 1912. The pattern is consistent. Arrival without verifiable history, rapid integration into the community through the exercise of exceptional charisma and apparent expertise, calculated theft, disappearance, and in some cases, staged death. The geographical progression suggests a methodical movement across the South, each new identity building on lessons learned from the previous imposture. In 1915, nearly 2 decades after Blackwood's disappearance, an elderly minister in a small church outside Lynchburg died peacefully in his sleep. He had served the congregation for 15 years, living modestly and gaining a reputation for kindness and wisdom. It was only when the church secretary was organizing his personal effects that she discovered a locked box containing newspaper clippings about the Roanoke case, along with surgical instruments and a journal documenting earlier identities. The final entry, dated just a week before his death, read simply, "The greatest disguise is virtue. Behind the mask of benevolence I have hidden in plain sight." They sought a monster and could not see the man who stood before them, offering blessings and comfort. The irony would be appreciated, I think, by God, if such a being exists. The discovery prompted a brief renewal of interest in the case, but with Blackwood himself beyond the reach of earthly justice, the matter was soon forgotten again. The church, wishing to protect its reputation, suppressed the evidence, and the minister was buried under the name by which his congregation had known him. Whether this final identity represented some form of redemption or merely the most elaborate deception of all remains an open question. In subsequent years, the case attracted the attention of early psychiatrists who saw in Blackwood's behavior evidence of what would later be termed dissociative identity disorder, or, in more popular language, multiple personality disorder. Unlike typical cases, however, Blackwood's alternate identities appeared to be consciously constructed rather than emerging spontaneously from trauma. What makes the Blackwood case so fascinating from a clinical perspective is the combination of calculation and immersion, wrote Dr. William Thornton in a 1927 monograph. He meticulously planned each identity, creating detailed backstories and practicing mannerisms. Yet, by all accounts, he also inhabited these roles completely, displaying none of the cognitive dissonance or breaks in character that typically betray imposture. It's as if he could will himself to become these fictional people, believing in their reality even as he engineered their creation. This psychological perspective offered a different kind of horror, the possibility that Blackwood had not merely been pretending to be Joseph Morris or Brother Ward or Dr. Graves, but had in some sense become them, experiencing the world through their perspectives, feeling their emotions, thinking their thoughts. If this were true, then the man who had begun as Elias Blackwood had effectively erased himself, replacing his original identity with a succession of temporary selves. The self is more fragile than we like to admit, Thornton concluded. We think of identity as something fixed and immutable, the bedrock of our existence. But cases like Blackwood's suggest that it might be more accurately understood as a kind of consensual fiction maintained through social reinforcement and habitual performance. Disturb those supporting structures enough, and the self can dissolve, reform, multiply. Today the Callahan farm is long gone, the land having been absorbed into Roanoke's expanding suburbs. No physical trace remains of the cabin where Elias Blackwood orchestrated his deceptions. Yet the legacy of the case persists in certain circles, particularly among those who study the psychology of identity and deception. Blackwood represents an extreme example of what psychologists now call identity plasticity, wrote Dr. Margaret Callahan Wright, great-granddaughter of Thomas and Margaret, in her 1968 monograph on the case. His ability to not only create but fully inhabit multiple personas suggests a mind for which identity was not fixed, but fluid. The disturbing implication is that he may not have been merely pretending to be these various characters. In some fundamental way, he may have actually become them. The story of Elias Blackwood has been passed down through generations in Roanoke, evolving into something between urban legend and cautionary tale. Parents warn children not to trust strangers too readily, and local folklore includes references to the man with many faces, who might appear in any guise. The historical facts have become entangled with fictional elaborations, creating a mythology that speaks to fundamental anxieties about identity and recognition. What remains undisputed is the extraordinary nature of Blackwood's deceptions, not just their extent and duration, but their psychological complexity. Unlike the common criminal who adopts a disguise temporarily and instrumentally, Blackwood seemed to view his transformations as ends in themselves, expressing through them a disturbing philosophy about the nature of selfhood. "I am not one man pretending to be many," he wrote in one of the journal entries found in the cabin. "I am many men inhabiting one body. Each identity is as real as the last, each life as authentic as any other. The only fiction is the idea that we must be consistent, that there exists some essential self that persists unchanging beneath our social performances. Perhaps the most enduring question raised by the case is one of recognition, not just of others, but of ourselves. If a man can so thoroughly transform himself that even those closest to him cannot penetrate the disguise, what does this tell us about the stability of identity itself? Are we defined by our faces, our voices, our mannerisms, all things that can be altered or disguised? Or is there some essential quality that persists beneath these superficial characteristics? Elias Blackwood's final deception may have been his greatest. By transforming himself into a respected minister, a man known for his goodness and wisdom, he challenged our fundamental assumptions about the nature of redemption. Was the elderly minister in Lynchburg merely playing his most convincing role, or had the impostor, through years of performing virtue, actually become virtuous? In the end, the Roanoke case offers no easy answers, only a disturbing reminder of how tenuous our understanding of others, and perhaps ourselves, truly is. The next time you encounter a stranger with an unusual appearance or a compelling voice, you might pause to wonder, who are they, really? And how can we ever truly know? The bandaged man who worked silently in the fields, the charismatic preacher who moved congregations to tears, the kindly minister who comforted the dying, all these men were Elias Blackwood, and yet none of them were. Behind the various masks he wore, whether made of bandages, scars, or assumed virtue, there may have been nothing at all, just an empty space where most of us have a self. Researchers continued to debate the psychological profile of Blackwood, with some suggesting that he exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy, a lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, superficial charm, and an ability to mimic emotions without experiencing them. Others argue that his case defies simple categorization, representing a unique constellation of abilities and pathologies that cannot be reduced to existing diagnostic frameworks. What makes Blackwood so disturbing is not just what he did, but what his actions reveal about the nature of human connection, wrote Dr. Callahan Wright. We want to believe that we know the people in our lives, that there is something authentic and unchanging about them that we can recognize and trust. Blackwood's case suggests that this belief may be more wishful thinking than reality. His ability to forge emotional connections with people, while concealing his true nature, or perhaps having no true nature at all, calls into question the very foundation of human relationships. The journals recovered from Blackwood's various residences provide fascinating insights into his psychological evolution. The earliest entries, dating from his time as a legitimate minister in Louisville, reveal a man struggling with conventional notions of identity and authenticity. He writes of feeling like an imposter in his own life, going through motions that seem increasingly arbitrary and meaningless. "I stand before the congregation each Sunday," one entry reads, "and speak words that are expected rather than felt. I offer comfort that I do not believe in, certainties that seem hollow, and yet they respond with gratitude and admiration, as if I have given them something of value. What does this say about me? What does it say about them?" As time passed, these philosophical musings gave way to more practical considerations of deception. Blackwood began to experiment with disguises, initially as a form of psychological exploration rather than criminal enterprise. He would alter his appearance slightly and visit neighboring towns, observing how differently people responded to him based on subtle changes in his presentation. "It is remarkable how malleable perception is," he wrote. "A different style of clothing, a slight change in posture or speech pattern, and I am, for all practical purposes, a different person. The woman who greets me warmly when I present myself as a businessman regards me with suspicion when I return as a laborer. Same face, same voice, entirely different reception." This experimentation eventually led to more elaborate deceptions, culminating in the radical self-transformation documented in the Roanoke case. What began as intellectual curiosity evolved into something darker, a rejection of social norms and ethical constraints, replaced by a personal philosophy that valued experimentation and transformation above all else. The criminal aspects of Blackwood's activities appear almost incidental in his journals, mentioned matter-of-factly without remorse or justification. The theft of church funds, the fraud perpetrated on various communities, these were described as practical necessities rather than moral transgressions. His true focus remained on the transformation itself, the creation and inhabitation of new identities. Money is merely a tool, he wrote, enabling the continuation of the work. Those who fixate on the financial aspects miss the true significance of what I am doing. I am not a common thief. I am an explorer of identity, mapping territories that most cannot even conceive of. This grandiose self-perception extended to his relationship with those who sought to apprehend him. He viewed law enforcement not as adversaries, but as participants in an elaborate game they didn't realize they were playing. In several journal entries, he described watching search parties pass near his hiding places, experiencing not fear, but a kind of exhilaration at his ability to exist just beyond their perception. They search for a fixed point, a stable identity that can be located and contained, he wrote. After one near capture, they cannot comprehend that I am process rather than entity, movement rather than position. By the time they identify where I have been, I am already elsewhere, already someone else. This fluidity extended to Blackwood's relationship with his own past. As his transformations became more extreme, he began to refer to his original self in the third person, as if Elias Blackwood were simply another role he had once played rather than his fundamental identity. In later journals, recovered from subsequent identities, he rarely mentioned Blackwood at all, referring instead to a succession of personas as if they were separate individuals with distinct biographies. Samuel Graves served his purpose, reads an entry believed to date from after the apparent suicide in North Carolina. His expertise provided access to resources that will be valuable in the next phase. But his manner was too clinical, too detached to sustain long-term integration in a community setting. The next iteration will need to balance authority with warmth, competence with approachability. The clinical tone of these passages, the dispassionate evaluation of identities as if they were products to be refined, suggests a mind that had moved beyond normal human experience into something both more limited and more expansive, limited in its capacity for genuine connection, expansive in its willingness to reimagine the boundaries of selfhood. For those who encountered Blackwood in his various guises, the experience was often transformative in its own way. Many reported feeling a sense of violation upon learning that someone they had trusted, sometimes deeply, had been an impostor. The betrayal was not just practical, but existential. If they could be so thoroughly deceived about someone's basic identity, what else might they be wrong about? I questioned everything afterward, said Emily Thornton, who had known Blackwood as Dr. Graves in North Carolina. Not just people, but my own judgment. I had trusted him completely, had even allowed him into my home to treat my children when they were ill. To learn that he was not who he claimed to be, that my perception could be so completely manipulated, it changed how I moved through the world. I became more cautious, yes, but also more aware of how much of what we take for granted is assumption rather than certainty. The ripple effects of Blackwood's deceptions extended far beyond those who knew him personally. The case became a cultural touchstone, referenced in sermons, newspaper editorials, and eventually academic literature as an example of the fragility of social trust. In an era of increasing mobility and urbanization, when Americans were increasingly likely to interact with strangers rather than lifelong neighbors, the Blackwood case represented a disturbing possibility. That the foundations of social order might be more vulnerable than previously imagined. The modern world requires us to extend trust to those we do not know intimately, wrote sociologist William Graham Sumner in a 1906 essay referencing the case. We must believe that the doctor who treats us is indeed a doctor, that the banker who holds our money is indeed a banker. Cases like Blackwood's reveal the potential costs of such necessary trust, But we cannot retreat to a world of universal suspicion without undermining the very basis of contemporary society. This tension between necessary trust and prudent caution continues to resonate in discussions of the case. Blackwood exploited fundamental social mechanisms, the assumption that people are who they claim to be, that credentials and appearances are reliable indicators of identity that remain essential to functioning communities. His deceptions were possible precisely because most people are not imposters, because the social cost of universal verification would be prohibitively high. We cannot live in a state of constant suspicion, Dr. Callahan Wright observed. Blackwood's case is disturbing precisely because it is exceptional. If such deceptions were common, we would develop stronger verification mechanisms, but the rarity of cases like his means that the social benefits of trust generally outweigh the risks of occasional betrayal. Nevertheless, the case did prompt some practical changes in how communities evaluated strangers. Churches began more routinely to verify the credentials of visiting preachers. Hospitals implemented stricter procedures for confirming medical qualifications, and financial institutions adopted more rigorous identification protocols. These measures did not eliminate imposture, but they raised the bar for successful deception, requiring more elaborate preparation and documentation. For criminologists, the Blackwood case represented an evolution in criminal methodology, a shift from direct confrontation to manipulation and deception. Unlike the outlaws of the American frontier, who relied on physical intimidation and force, Blackwood achieved his ends through psychological means, exploiting social trust and institutional credibility. His approach presaged the confidence men of the 20th century, who would similarly use charisma and false identity to separate victims from their money. Blackwood understood something fundamental about human psychology, wrote FBI agent Harold Wilson in a 1940 analysis. People want to trust, want to believe in the authenticity of others. By presenting a convincing facade and telling people what they wanted to hear, he could overcome natural skepticism and create relationships based entirely on fiction. The most disturbing aspect of his method was how rarely it failed, how consistently people accepted the reality he presented to them. The psychological impact of the case extended to questions of personal identity as well. If someone as seemingly stable as Elias Blackwood could fragment into multiple personas, what did that suggest about the nature of selfhood more generally? Were all identities, to some degree, performances, less stable and coherent than we prefer to believe? The case invites us to consider the extent to which all of us engage in forms of identity management, wrote philosopher Richard Jenkins in his 2008 book, Social Identity. We present different aspects of ourselves in different contexts: the professional self at work, the parental self at home, the social self among friends. Blackwood's extreme case simply highlights dynamics that operate more subtly in ordinary life. This perspective does not excuse Blackwood's deceptions or minimize the harm he caused, but it does place his behavior on a continuum with more common human experiences rather than treating it as entirely alien. The difference, of course, lies in degree and intent. Most people's variation in self-presentation reflects authentic aspects of a complex but integrated identity, not calculated deception designed to manipulate others for personal gain. The final mystery of the Blackwood case lies in the question of his true nature, if indeed he had one. Was there, beneath the succession of elaborate personas, a core identity that persisted across transformations? Did the elderly minister who died in Lynchburg represent Blackwood's authentic self, a final role, or something in between, a persona that had, through long inhabitation, become as real as any original identity could claim to be? The most disturbing possibility, wrote Dr. Thornton, is that Blackwood himself may not have known the answer to this question. After decades of constructing and inhabiting alternate identities, the boundaries between performance and authenticity may have dissolved entirely, leaving not a man wearing masks, but a succession of masks with no face beneath them. This existential uncertainty extends to Blackwood's apparent redemption as the kindly minister of Lynchburg. The journals found after his death suggest a man who had grown weary of deception, who had perhaps found in religious service a stability that had eluded him in his years of constant transformation. But they also reveal a persistent fascination with the mechanics of identity, a continued awareness of the constructed nature of his presentation. "The congregation responds to my performance of wisdom and compassion," reads one of the final entries. They see what they need to see, the benevolent spiritual guide, the steady moral compass. The irony is that after so many years of playing this role, I find myself experiencing these qualities as if they were native to me. The mask has grown into the flesh. Whether this represents genuine moral evolution or merely a more sophisticated level of self-deception remains an open question. Can virtue performed consistently over time transform into authentic character? Can someone who has lived as many people ultimately become none or all of them? These philosophical questions have ensured the case's enduring interest beyond its historical moment. In an age of digital identities and virtual interaction, where presentation of self is increasingly mediated and manipulated, the story of a man who physically remade himself to enable new identities resonates in unexpected ways. Blackwood's physical transformations seem primitive compared to contemporary technology, observed media theorist Jean Baudrillard in a 1995 lecture referencing the case. Today, one need not scar one's face to become someone else. One simply creates a new profile, a new digital presence. The physical continuity that constrained even Blackwood's elaborate deceptions has been transcended, allowing for more fluid and multiple identities than he could have imagined. Yet the fundamental questions raised by the case remain relevant. What constitutes authentic identity? How can we know others or ourselves in a world where presentation is increasingly divorced from physical reality? What happens to trust and community when identity becomes more fluid and verification more difficult? The Roanoke case offers no definitive answers to these questions, only a disturbing example of their practical implications. Elias Blackwood, or whatever name we assign to the consciousness that animated his various personas, remains an enigma, a man who challenged fundamental assumptions about the stability of identity and the reliability of perception. Perhaps the true horror of the case lies not in what Blackwood did, but in what his existence suggests about the fragility of human identity. In a world where such complete transformation is possible, can we ever truly trust the faces we see in the mirror or the ones that smile at us across a dinner table? As you turn off this recording and go about your day, that question may linger. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of Elias Blackwood, a man who ceased to exist long before his body died, might appreciate the doubt he continues to sow, more than a century after he first wrapped bandages around his self-mutilated face and knocked on the door of a farmhouse on the outskirts of Roanoke.